Welcome to the Mike Litton Experience Podcast. Mike has over 31 years experience in real estate, finance, and investing. He's passionate about being a father, a teacher, a realtor, an investor, and a leader. Everyone has a story, and our passion is to help them tell it. And now, introducing the host of the Mike Litton Experience, Mike Litton.
So what can you expect from the Mike Litton Experience? You can expect stories that will inspire, motivate, advice that will sharpen your focus, and expert information on real estate, finance, and market conditions. Did you do it?
4.5 years. And
Okay.
then there was a little bit of managerial stuff going on there. They were changing some pay plans. And then I was working on the book for about 4.5 years, about the same time I started the book. And I said, you know what? I'm good. I am going to quit. I'm going to finish this book. I have to get it done.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just going to step out and do it. So yeah, that's what happened. That's kind of why I quit. I just said, I need to stop relying on somebody else for my money and get out and just either figure it out or do something else.
So time to move on.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to show the cover of the book, right? Very proud of you, by the way. Good job. This is A-hole to awesome, right? It's not actually A-hole, it's something else, but because of our rating, like we talked about, that's all we can say. But people can fill in the blank, right? So this is an amazing book. And I read you in it. I literally see your life in there. And the thing that I love the most about it is, and I told you this before we hit record, you take stock of who you are. You take, and people don't do that, right? The thing that you did that I think is the healthiest thing I've ever seen is you take stock of who you are and how you got to where you are, right? And a lot of it started in Barstow with a lot of that divisiveness and a lot of the, polarization, so to speak, that kind of thing. And it built up a lot of anger, right? And I think some of it obviously came from your childhood and some of the things with your mom and your dad and, issues with the family and that kind of thing. You're human, dude. It's part of it. The thing is, at some point you get to a place to where you decide to write this book. How'd you get there? Because there are a lot of people that are listening to this that are thinking about writing a book or have decided they're going to write a book and they're putting it off and they're not doing what you did, right? How did you come to that? How did you come to the decision, number one, to do it? Number two, to start it?
So I started probably my self-improvement journey. I don't know, like sometime around, I was about 30 years old. I started reading because I knew there was better things out there, right?
Yeah.
There's something better than what I was doing.
Right.
Like I went to work every single day. I went to school while I was working. I coached my kids' teams. I was just not a happy guy. I was just like, I was happy for my kids. I was happy, had happy moments, but like my overall joy was just not there.
Yeah.
Like I had road rage. I was probably one of the most brutal coaches that you would ever. Everybody learned a lot and they came back, but I was Bobby Knight, like on steroids.
Wow.
I did some stuff that people go, and we all laugh about it now, right?
Yeah.
But just over time, I became this crappy person. And then when I moved down here, I met some pretty awesome people. Sometimes, that change of environment, that you moving to a different place where you just don't know people, right? And I was at the power plant one day and we were working, and I was my normal whiny, complainy, a couple other words, self about this job. And this one guy tells me, he goes, "You're just like bop, 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 bop." And when he told me that, that was the second that I knew I had to change, because nobody wanted to be like that guy, right?
Yeah.
Everything was F words coming out of his mouth. There was never anything nice that ever came out of his mouth.
Yeah.
So that was like the biggest kick square in the middle of my
Yeah.
middle section here.
Yeah.
And it was like, dude, you got to do something. You have to figure this out. So I
Like
started,
you
like,
realized
again.
you didn't like who you were.
Oh yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, I knew I was not good, but when it came to like to somebody else actually going, yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah, that's the whole
Yeah.
thing. Like I said, it was like a smack. I mean, just a straight kick in the jimmy,
Yeah.
like, hey, you're a dummy. And I was like, okay. So I started pounding away, and I probably read 500 books, like maybe
Wow.
even it's been a ton.
Yeah.
And like what I found was like so many people are in that same thing, right?
Yeah.
Everybody writes, and you got to do this, got to do that, got to do this, got to do that. And it was all fine and dandy. And I would get to certain spots and then I would fall back. I would get
Yeah.
to certain spots and fall back. And I talked to people, and people were like, yeah, dude, I do the same thing all the time.
Yeah.
That's me. I read the book, I get motivated, and I'm like, dude, I think I can write a book that like kind of touches to the common person who has these common issues, right? And make it relatable. Obviously, we can't. It's a G-rated thing. I
Right.
do use a few foul words in my book. It's
Yeah.
just my cellar way of speaking, and there's actually studies done. I'm just going to throw this out real quick, that the using foul language sometimes makes you or gives you a perception of a more trustworthy person, right?
Yeah.
Because you're not trying to hide anything.
Right.
And I'm not trying to glorify cursing, but that's part of where my book was, that people
Well,
sometimes
you're
have that
authentic.
issue.
You're
Yeah,
authentic. Okay. And there's everything about, I mean, it's one of the best things about your book is your authenticity. And it's one of the things that I enjoyed the most when I was working with you before was how authentic you were. Right. And I don't know if you remember this, but there were times when I would call you up and go, Ernie, I've been thinking about you and you need to do this. Ernie, I've been
yeah.
thinking about you and your new sales career and you need to do right. I couldn't help myself, dude. I
I mean,
couldn't
because
help
it was
myself.
my first like month,
Yeah.
of doing it. Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't help myself. Right. Because I want to try and add value everywhere I go. Right. And so you were the brunt of some of that. Right. And I know you're on the phone going, okay, I got it. Get off the phone. Right. But
Nah, dude,
it
I
was
appreciate
right.
it.
Well, I can be a pain in the tuchus. Okay. It happens, but I'm authentic too. Right.
Yeah.
Where I'll literally pick up if I see something that if I see something with somebody that I think a lot of, and I think it's something that I can help with or I can contribute or whatever, I'm going to pick up the phone and call. They're either going to like it or they're not, and there's nothing I can do to control that. Right? I'm not in a popularity
100%.
contest. I'm just trying to help, right? And so and some of the times it was you were kind of down, you were kind of having you were struggling a little bit, right? And sometimes it was like cuz I don't know if Tammy's ever shared this with you, but we worked together for a number of years, and one of the things that the agents that worked with our agency used to say is and it was a brokerage that I owned and ran for 18 years. They would call me up and they'd go, I just need 5 minutes of mic time. Like they would go out in the world and the world would beat them up and the whole thing, and they just needed 5 minutes of talking with me, venting, asking questions, whatever, right? But they just needed to talk with somebody who had a positive approach at this, right? And could look hard enough to find positivity in everything that happens. You with me? And
100%.
yeah, and it's like, dude, that was one of the coolest things ever. Like one of the coolest things that people ever do to compliment me is to call me up and go, I just need 5 minutes. I just need 5 minutes of mic time, right? So like the
100%.
episodes where we don't do interviews for our podcast, we call them mic time,
Yeah.
right? Because it's just
Yeah.
me and you, right? I'm just
That's
telling
cool.
you, right? I'm sharing with you life lessons, whatever. So talk a little bit about, well, let's talk about chapter one. So chapter one is I'm an a-hole, right? Talk about
Yeah.
that for a second.
So to get to that spot, you actually have to like look at yourself in the mirror and go, man, I'm not doing some stuff right. And like I'm reading books and I'm trying to just be a better person, but at the same time, I talk about this in the book, is I'm listening to Brian Tracy, one of my favorite authors ever. And
Mine
I'm
too. Yeah.
listening to him and he's talking about like, don't let other people grab your emotions. You're in control of your emotions, right? I
Right.
don't remember the exact wording, but that's, and I'm driving down the road and I see this gentleman getting on the road and I knew that he was going to cut me off.
Yeah.
And instead of just falling back a little bit, which I do now,
Yeah.
I squeeze up, he cuts me off. There's a giant scene on the freeway where air bombs are flying, fingers, everything. And that was like, again, that, you know, I had that moment in the power plant where I realized what I was. But then I finally realized, dude, I just gave my emotions away to somebody that doesn't know me.
hmm
And like for that to hit was like, that means myself, me, I'm tiny. If I allowed somebody to do that, it makes me a tiny person, right?
Yeah.
And so like that was like that great epiphany right there. Bro, take control of your emotions. And so that was the first little step that I learned was I'm in control of my emotions. No matter what the outside world does, it's still up to me what I'm going to put out. Granted, I'm not perfect.
I think this is one of the most important chapters in the book, and I'll tell you why. People need to take stock. They need to look at themselves in the mirror and go, hey, come on, right? And
I
that does
agree.
not happen enough. And that's why I feel like your book is so incredibly important. So in chapter 2, you talk about triggers and patterns. And I love this because you're talking about unraveling the mysteries of awkwardness. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah. So I think it's again knowing your emotions and then knowing why certain things trigger those. Right. I had this thing about being time. I
Mhm.
already talked about it in there with the Navy, but if anybody else was late, I would get like super like just irritated, like mad, like I couldn't even figure out why I would get so mad. And then by doing some reading and then chatting with my brother, we went back and we found out that our dad, when my mom and dad separated, he would call, or we wouldn't see him for months on time. And then when he would call, he would say, "Hey, I'll be right out." And then he wouldn't show up.
Yeah.
So
It's a trigger.
that became a trigger,
Yeah.
right? So my trigger was anybody being late. I'm thinking that they're not showing up.
Yeah.
And then my pattern was just to get super defensive about it. And
Well, and
so I
they
started.
you feel like they don't care,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
That was the thing, right? Like I was not valued. And that's
Right.
one of the little things that like kind of, but once I was able to start picking out these little triggers, now you see what they are and you're kind of like, let's just move it to the side. It's
Yeah.
not that big of a
You're
deal.
on the other side looking at it, right? And you're going, oh, come on.
Yeah.
So chapter 3 is about empathy, the not so secret sauce. Talk about that for a second.
So that's um like I always say there's like three keys to just if everybody did these three things, we would live in a fantastic world. Like our world would be so much better. And it's empathy, forgiveness, and kindness.
Mhm.
Empathy is just for me, like I never saw the other side of the story.
Yeah.
I was the most opinionated person ever. Like you threw out a subject, I had an opinion on it, and my opinion was correct.
Yeah.
I didn't want to hear the other side. I didn't have time for the other side. And once I learned like, hey man, you're not 100% correct. And listen to this. And then if you guys can actually, one of my best friends, I don't know if I should, but I'm gonna say this. One of my best friends, he's liberal, I'm ultra conservative. So when we chat, we have this great conversation that we can just pick each other's brains, like why you think this, why you think that. And a lot of people can't do that because there's no empathy on the other side, right?
Well,
You
they
don't
can,
care
but
what
they
the other
don't.
person thinks.
They can, but they don't. Okay.
Yeah,
Empathy
yeah,
is something that people have, they just don't use it. And it takes
100%,
effort, right?
100%.
And in order to get to empathy, you've got to look at yourself the way you did and take stock, right? You can't
Yeah,
get there. You can't tap that because you just lock it away. And all of a sudden, everything you say is perfectly right, and everything everybody else says is perfectly wrong. And it's like, what? You also talk about building emotional intelligence. Talk about that for a second, because that's a muscle, dude. That's something that people need to learn, and they need to use it every day.
So yeah, that was probably the longest and hardest part for me of like this little transformation. Like I understood the empathy, I started working on the forgiveness, but that emotional intelligence of actually like knowing what the different emotions are and like why you're having them, it's pretty amazing. Like, everybody just thinks mad, sad, happy, glad kind of deal, right? I mean, just to put in a super generic, but there's so many little mixed up parts of that, right? Like, being happy because you're hanging out with your kids is a different happy than having a drink and getting that kind of happiness, right?
Right.
So there's these different levels of happiness. And once I learned that, like, hey, I can have joy and have, even when the world is going to crap around me, if I have this inner peace and solitude, man, it is what it is. And that's kind
Yeah.
of that's how I live, like, kind of life now. It is what it is, man. I can't control it. I'm going to, do my best to be the best part of it.
So practicing gratitude, I think, is essential. I think it's one of the most important parts of even having any modicum of happiness in your life. Talk about that for a second. I think that's one
Yeah.
of the best chapters in the book, by the way.
So the gratitude, it again, I guess everything was like a little rough steps for me because I
Yeah.
lacked I lacked it all. Like I didn't even know what gratitude was.
Yeah.
Gratitude for me was like that that was owed to me, right? Because of the crap that like happened. I didn't have gratitude. You owed me that.
Right.
You owed me the job. I'm here. I'm doing my work. You owe me the money. This, that kind of deal. But I started changing with the gratitude, was like being grateful, like for the little things, right?
Hmm.
Grateful for waking up in a house that had a roof, like
Yeah.
grateful for being able to go to the store and buy the food. So what I started doing was every single morning, every single day, I would write 3 to 5 things I was grateful for. And this is a huge key to what I found. At first, I started just 3 things I was grateful for. But now I do one thing I'm grateful for me, like what I'm grateful about me, my health, my whatever it is, right?
Hmm.
One thing I'm grateful for my spouse, Tammy. One
Hmm.
thing, because sometimes that's hard, right?
It
Because
is.
when they make you mad, you don't want to write what you're grateful for them
Yeah.
about. So I started doing that, making sure every day. And then also one thing I'm grateful for, like in the world, like what is happening in the world, like just the beauty of the flowers, the taste of a lemon, whatever it was, but picking 3 things in those, one thing in each of those categories.
Well, they talk about an attitude of gratitude, right? What was interesting about what you just said was you had a lack of gratitude when you first started working. And that lack of gratitude made you decide to take matters into your own hands and start stealing things, right?
Yeah.
And you got into trouble doing that, right?
Yes.
That was that lack of gratitude. That was, you owe me this. You with me?
100%.
Right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
that had to grow over the years until you got to a point to where you're like, wait a minute. What? I have so much going on. I have so much going on in my life. I have so much happening. I have so much, right? And Tammy is one of those people that if you weren't a world-class guy, she wouldn't be with you. She wouldn't give you 2 seconds, right? Let alone marry you, spend a life with you. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the last chapter is mastering the art of personal boundaries. Talk about that for a second.
This is what and again, this is, I think, one of the biggest keys for people is because they don't set boundaries for themselves.
Yeah.
This is something my wife actually lacks in her work. And that's what I've tried to, help her grow with, because people take advantage. If you're nice, people will take advantage of you.
Oh yeah.
And being taken advantage of steps back all those other things that you've worked
Mhm.
on, right? So like
Well, it
if you're
causes
getting
resentment. Right? And all
Exactly.
of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, right? You're
And
right,
that's
man.
and setting those boundaries, like, I have no problem telling anybody no. Like, hey, do you want to come over? Nah, I'm good. Like, we all need our own time.
Yeah.
And if you don't keep your own personal time and have respect for your personal time,
Yeah.
then everything else just gets jumbled. And I think that setting boundaries and actually having them, most amazing. It's a life-changing thing to be able to tell somebody, "Nah, I'm good. I do not need to do that today."
Yeah. Well, it takes effort,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And you
Yeah.
have to make yourself a priority. And a big part of your book is making yourself a priority. It's kind of like when you're on an airplane and they do the safety thing, right? Yeah. And they tell you put your mask on first and then help somebody else.
Percent,
If
man.
you're going to make any progress in your life whatsoever, you have to get to a place. And I learned this like 6 years ago. You have to get to a place to where you make yourself the priority so that you can take care of the other people around you, right? Because if you're not here, you're not able to take care of them.
Yeah, I
What
agree.
good are you, right? And I think that's the biggest part of this book is you got to a point to where you realized, number one, who you were. You got to a point where you realized, number two, you didn't like who you were, and you needed to figure out a way to fix it. And you did. And then you wrote a book about it that now helps a lot of us look at this and go, you know what? We really do need to work on this. And I hope everybody reads your book and I hope they apply it. I hope they don't do what a lot of people do where they read the book, they get all excited, and then they just don't do, yeah, they just don't do anything with it, right? Because everybody has, I mean, there are statistics that people will go to a seminar and they'll come home and 90 some percent of them won't do a thing. Nothing changes, right? And so what I would suggest to people is just make small changes, right? Even if all you
Micro
do is
changes.
wake up every day and write one thing down that you're grateful for,
Yeah.
right? Versus 3 to 5, work up to 3 to 5. Okay.
Yeah.
But please sit down and take stock of who you are, what you're about, if you're proud of yourself. And if you're not, what do you need to do? And get this book so that you can learn how to improve your life. You can learn how to get to awesome, right? And that's, I think, a big, big part of the magic of what you've done. And I just have a couple of real quick questions for you. What was your favorite thing about writing the book? And what's the number one thing you learned?
Favorite thing about writing the book is the sense of accomplishment. If you
So
read in the
finishing
book,
it.
yeah, no, like, no kidding, man. I mean, it took me 4.5 years, and until like AI came along, I just got lost.
Yeah.
So finishing it was like the best thing because then I finally knew that I did enough work in my life to get that part done.
Yeah.
Because I started so many other things and I never had the discipline to fully finish. And I
Right.
did finish this one. So that is by far my biggest enjoyment or about writing the book. And
And
what
you
was the
nailed
other
it,
one?
dude. You nailed it. What
Well,
was
I
your
appreciate
favorite
it.
thing? And then what's the number one thing you learned?
The number one thing I learned is that nobody's perfect,
Yeah.
right? And it's okay to make mistakes. Is just learn from them.
Yeah.
And like that, like learning from not because I was a perfectionist with everything. And like it's an oxymoron. Like it was almost like contradictory because I did so many mistakes, but I was still a perfectionist.
Yeah.
And once I learned that, hey, dude, everybody makes mistakes. A lot of people are going through the same struggles that you're going through.
Mhm.
That was the biggest thing. And it was so relieving to just be able to go, you're not a bad guy. You just
Yeah.
have some bad characteristics and we can fix those.
It's almost liberating, right? Because if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying, number one. Number two, making mistakes is a way to go about learning. It's a way to gather wisdom, right?
Yeah.
It's like, bad judgment leads to these mistakes, right? Then you make the mistakes, you learn from it, that bad judgment turns into good judgment, which then eventually turns into wisdom. I mean, it's amazing how that cycle happens, but it's a part of it. And it's liberating to give yourself permission, which is what you've done, to give yourself permission to make mistakes and ultimately to learn from them, right? To become a better person because of it. And I truly, truly am so proud of you and so proud of your accomplishment. And more than anything, I'm proud of who you've become.
Appreciate it, Mike.
I'm really proud of you, dude. And I'm really, really super happy that you were our guest on the Mike Litton Experience. Thanks again for being here.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you having me on.
Appreciate you, buddy. We hope you enjoyed another episode of the Mike Litton Experience. If you did, do us a favor, smash that subscribe button, tell your friends, family, and coworkers about our program, and wherever you get your podcasts, please leave us a rating. It helps us to connect with quality people just like you.
And that's a wrap. Another episode of the Mike Litton Experience in the books. Reach out to Mike on Instagram at Litton Realty. Want to meet with Mike? Check out Calendly.com/Rio760.